Alright, so this lesson is going to be relatively short and sweet, but that does not take away from the importance of it. So we're talking about evolution. So what is evolution? It's the theoretical process by which all species develop from earlier forms of life. So evolution is currently a theory, or it is a theory. It will remain a theory because we actively try to explain what it is we're observing. So that's the difference between theory and law. It will never be a law because we're not just observing it um, and leaving it be, but we're trying to explain how it's happening. So the example we'll keep coming back to for this lesson is the evidence that supports relatedness between whales and um, what are current day hippos. So we have enough information to relate them to at least some hooved animals. Um, and we'll see what those are named later, ungulates. So fossil records. Fossil records are the first thing we look at or can look at to determine some sort of relatedness. Um, we can see this change over the course of time from one organism to the next to help us see how an organism has evolved from what it once was to what it is today. The deeper we dig in the earth, the older our fossils are going to be. So the further down we go, we'll find things that are even older than closer to the surface. So if we look at this image, this is a skeleton of an a mammal, and it's dated to be roughly 52 million years ago. Um, so we can see that it obviously lived on land. It was a hooved animal. We can determine that by its feet down here. Had a tail, all that good stuff. Lived on land. About 2 million years later, we find this skeleton. So there are a lot of similarities between the two, particularly looking at this head. But one major difference we see is the direction this pelvis is facing. Also, how large the legs are, front and back. This scapula up here, this big triangle piece, is much larger 2 million years later than it was 2 million years previous. And that's likely to help it hold all of the new muscle that's present there because now these aren't actual legs. It's hard to tell with a skeleton, but it's theorized that these were actually covered in more fin like or flipper like um, membranes. And then another 10 million years later, we have this skeleton, long, straight backbone, arms are, or the flippers are about the same as they were down here, and the rear legs are almost entirely gone because there's no use for them. As we move up in time, this animal has spent more and more time in the water. More we can look at are homologous structures. So body parts on different species that are similar are most likely to have evolved from a common ancestor. So if we look at the arms of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat, they all have the same structure. So in the upper arm of a person, we have a humerus. The orange bone here is the radius, and the yellow bone back there is the ulna, or the cream is the ulna, and then these yellow little spots in the wrist are 7 bones that collectively make up the carpals. So this is the structure of a human arm. We look at a cat and it's the same thing. We have this humerus, radius, ulna, and the carpals. In a whale, we see it again. We have the humerus, the radius, the ulna, and the carpals. And even in a bat, we have the humerus, radius, ulna, and carpals. So the fact that these are all so similar point us to the thought that maybe there's something they have in common, maybe a common ancestor. Vestigial structures are remnants or organs of structures that once had a function in an earlier ancestor, but they don't anymore. So again, back to our whale. This whale still has a pelvis and femurs. Does a whale have legs? No. Does it have any use for a pelvis or femurs? No. It swims. The only use for these structures are for an organism with legs, but yet a whale has them. So that tells us that at some point in time, one of its ancestors did need them. And so these are vestigial structures. They still remain even though they're not needed anymore. In people, we have wisdom teeth. These are considered vestigial structures because we don't need them anymore. We can pull them without any problems. So it was thought that a long time ago, when people didn't have as good dental hygiene and their teeth got worn out and rotted and broke off a lot more than they do now, that having a small set of teeth come in later in life would benefit the humans and their ability to eat and chew their food. Embryology looks at the embryos of different organisms and the similarities between them. So for an example, we have a fish, reptile, bird, and human. All of these embryos look really, really similar, including the fact that they all have tails and they all have gill slits. This doesn't mean they're functioning gills, but there are gill slits. So in some animals, obviously like a fish, the gill slits later developed into gills. But in reptiles, birds, and humans, these gill slits actually later develop into our ears. But yet we all have this exact same structure as embryos. So that is suggestive of relatedness between all these organisms. Molecular evidence, that's something like DNA. If there's a lot of DNA that's similar between organisms, it's pretty suggestive that there's some relatedness there. So for example, we look at a hippopotamus and a humpback whale. We have this short sequence of DNA, and we can spot 3 differences, but the rest is the same. So the first difference is this T and C right here. Those are different. But then we have the same CC, CC, TG, G, CA. It's the same. GT, GCA, GT, CC, A. So we have one more difference. We have a G and C swap right here. And then over here we have GT, GGT, GT, GCT. So we have one more difference with this CG switch here. So there's 3 points where nucleotides have been swapped, but the majority of this DNA is similar. When there's enough of this DNA that's similar from one species to the next, that's going to be suggestive of some sort of relationship between the two. So how does this sort of work? How does evolution happen, or why? So one of the causes is geography. Some sort of geographic isolation and environmental differences could lead to speciation. So speciation is when one species forms from another species. So how could that happen? Let's look at these beetles. So we have one population of beetles. And there's going to be some sort of event that's going to geographically isolate them. So let's say we have a flood. A flood comes into the forest and creates a new river. So now this population of beetles is now separated into 2 populations. They can't cross that river. So over the course of time, these 2 populations are going to experience very different environmental pressures, or they may experience very different environmental pressures on each side of the river. Some, say the north side of the river, the one up top, it has more sunlight. It also has more predators, things like that. So this population is going to be pressured to adapt to the increase in sunlight and the increase in predators. The population on the bottom might have less sunlight. They might have a lot more food available to them, and who knows what else. All sorts of different things, all sorts of different changes in the environment could occur. So over the time when there's enough of these changes, and over thousands of years, when these beetles have time to adapt and to evolve, eventually they're going to get so different because they have two very different environments they live in now, that they're going to become two different species. They'll no longer be able to breed with one another and have fertile offspring. So what once used to be one population of beetles and one species of beetles has become two species of beetles because of this geographic isolation. And then another way is coevolution. So this is when two or more species evolve in a response to a change in the other. So a classic example is the bat and the underwing moth. So bats like to eat moths. It's their favorite food. So the bats, they hunt at night because that's when the moths are out. And so it's hard to see at night. So they've evolved this ability to use echolocation, where they put out these really high-pitched squeals, and those sound waves will go out and hit objects, and they'll bounce back to the bat, and the bat will be able to put together some sort of image in its head of what's out there. So this is a good alternative to being able to use its eyes that aren't very useful in the dark of night. So by being able to do this, they're able to more easily find, catch, and eat the moths. With the more energy that they're getting from this, they're able to reproduce more, and that ability becomes commonplace in all bats. So the moths have also adapted. They adapted in response to the bat's echolocation. And that's not to say that the moths got together to have a secret meeting and say, all right, we got to do something about this. It was more that a sequence of random mutations enabled them to do this. So what happened was the moths adapted. They can now hear the really high-pitched squeals that the bats give off. And that really high-pitched squeal sends a reflex response to the moth's wings. So when it hears the high-pitched squeal, the moth starts to fly really erratically by reflex. And when it flies really erratically, that throws off the bat. The bat doesn't know where the moth is anymore. It thought it was one place, but then the moth started to fly all crazy, so the moth's in a different place, thus avoiding getting eaten. So that's going to help the moth to survive. The longer it can survive, the more it can reproduce. So over time, that ability caught on and took over the entire species. So these two co-evolved. There is an evolution event in a response to one another. So who knows? Maybe one day the bat will evolve again in response to get better. But we probably won't ever know in our own lifetime. So this is evolution, short and sweet, but lots to it. So make sure you come and ask me questions if you have any.